All right, welcome back. So in this video, I want to now talk about the second thing you can do once you've learned to control your subconscious. So the second thing, and I touched on it the last video, the second thing has to do with your performance, right? So very important. In other words, once you learn how to control your subconscious, you can actually increase what I call your performance level. So we start talking about the concept of a performance level in chapter 4, chapter 5. But in book 1, but yes, you're basically, if you just think of your overall ability to perform well at a thing, and by the way, it could be anything. It doesn't matter what I'm talking about, right? Or I should say what the activity is, right? Whether you're talking about singing or you're talking about music, right? You're talking about making beats, right? I used to make beats. Whether you're talking about performing in sports, right? Playing basketball or boxing, right? Or if you're talking about, just conversation, right? So I used to do that a lot too. If you want to be a better conversationalist, it doesn't matter, right? Whatever the activity, by the way, it can also be academic activities like mathematics or writing or something, right? Or poetry, writing songs, whatever the case is, whatever the activity, you can use your subconscious to increase your performance, right? And what I'm referring to is classically known as, is called being in the zone, right? And so I forgot to mention last video, right? In modern psychology, I believe, right? There's no consensus on where emotions come from or how they work, right? There are many theories, and the theories kind of get some of the puzzle, but there are other things we see with emotions that don't quite fit that theory, right? And the reason is because they do not acknowledge that emotions are a metaphysical concept. So they come from the subconscious, which is metaphysical. And that's the exact problem I ran into when I was coming up with this theory, right? So when I recognized that my own emotions came from my subconscious, I kept trying to explain them in terms that made sense for them coming from physical materials. And I couldn't really explain them or understand or come up with a theory with my own experience of my emotions until I recognized that they were metaphysical. Then I could ascribe properties to them that I knew physical properties didn't have, or at least didn't seem like physical material. It didn't seem like physical materials could have that property to me, right? So I'm like, oh, if it's metaphysical, then I could just give them this property. And so in the process of doing that, I came up with a theory for the subconscious, and that can much more completely explain the nature of emotions, right? And the reason that they're unable to, and like I said, in modern psychology, there's no general consensus among scientists, I guess, right, on where emotions come from, because there's holes in every single theory. And like I said, that comes from the fact that they're metaphysical and not physical. And all these theories are always trying to create a theory that presupposes that emotions are physical. And so the same thing happens with being in the zone, right? So we know that when you're in the zone, we don't really know in modern science or modern psychology, there's not a complete understanding of what the zone is or where it comes from or how to enter it. Right? And there's a lot of videos that, because I looked them up, right? I looked up a lot of videos to see if they say what I say about being in the zone. And they touch on it, right? They touch on it to a degree. But none of them really quite get it right, at least according to what I believe, because being in the zone or entering the zone is a subconscious phenomena, right? To get into the zone with some activity, you have to do certain things with your subconscious. And I should mention that actually took me years to figure out how to control the subconscious properly to enter the zone. Now, I could always do it, but I never could do it efficiently, right? I think I mentioned this in the videos again. So, I started talking about how to enter the zone in chapter 13, right? But I'll just say for now, it's a lot of theory involved. That might be the most theory-intense chapter of both books, right? It's just there is a lot to explain with that process, right? That's why I believe a lot of people, there's no real consensus on what the zone is, how to enter it, and things like that. There's just too much. First of all, you absolutely need to understand the subconscious and recognize that it's metaphysical. That's the beginning. Almost no one does that, right? So they're just not going to understand how the zone works. So you need the structure of the subconscious, but then you have to work within that structure to understand how it changes itself to allow you to be in the zone. And it took me years to figure that out. And not to say I was like doing it every day, but I knew for years that the zone was a product of the subconscious mind, but I could not figure out the exact connection. It took me I think I was 2 years into it before I figured that out. No. I figured it out later. I think I was 3 years into it. But anyway, yeah, so it took me a long time to figure it out, but eventually I did, and I talk about that in chapter 13. But ultimately, when you enter the zone, so in science, or I should say, sometimes the zone is called a flow state, right? Because that's what it feels like. So many thoughts and feelings are just flowing into your mind, and it's almost like your conscious mind, you're not consciously thinking of things as much, right? So it's just called the flow state. And I used to actually call it that too when I first discovered this. This is when I was in my early 20s. That's when I first discovered the subconscious mind has a representation to some degree. Now, I didn't understand it anywhere near, right? The level, I didn't have anywhere near the level of understanding that I have now about the subconscious. But that was literally the first moment that I began to see the subconscious as a tiny bit of what I recognize it as today, right, in my early 20s. And that actually happened because I started entering the zone, right? I was trying to learn how to be a better conversationalist, and I found myself entering the zone. And I was always a theory guy, right? So I was trying to create a theory on how this works. I didn't quite get it then, but I wasn't trying to at that time, actually, but I did notice this. But I noticed myself entering the zone, and I called it a flow state as well. But, and actually, physically, I believe what happens in your brain is your prefrontal cortex. I believe it's called hypoprefrontality or transient hypoprefrontality, something like that, right? And basically what it's referring to is a selective drop in the function of your prefrontal cortex. So your prefrontal cortex is basically, in a nutshell, is responsible for you making executive decisions, right, with your conscious mind. So when the prefrontal cortex drops in activity, right, you're not able to make executive decisions as much, and you start to act more on instinct. And that's when I talk about chapter 13, that's going to make perfect sense based on what I talk about chapter 13. And so we recognize that that's what's going on in the brain when a person's in the zone or in a flow state. And some people recognize that there's certain components that help you to enter the zone, right? Like maintaining focus, not caring about what's going on or caring about the outcome. All that's true. But none of these things aren't the complete picture, right? To enter the zone is it's a lot you have to understand about the subconscious to be able to manipulate it properly so that you get into that zone or flow-like state. But once you understand, you can do it with anything, right? You can do it all the time, right? You could, like I said, I used to make beats, right? So when I spent all those years, right, because it was years for me writing the book, I basically had to stop making beats. And something funny happened is for a short time I started making beats again, right? So for those who don't know, I'm kind of the old school person. I don't know if that's an old school word, but beats are basically just instrumentals. They're instrumentals that are meant to have vocals. So some instrumentals, or musical instrumentals, aren't meant to have vocals, and those are be like movie instrumentals, right? So they sound a little different than instrumentals that are meant to have vocals. The instrumentals with vocals sound more empty. So I like to make those kinds, right? And I eventually learned that when I learned how to get in the zone, I started doing that with making beats. And my music would turn out to be way better. Now, I'm not great at making music, right? That's not really my talent. But the beats I would make would be way better, right, when I would start applying the principles, which we're going to learn about in chapter 13, when I apply the principles for getting into the zone, right? Because my performance would always just go through the roof anytime I got into the zone, right? But eventually I realized I couldn't, I didn't want to stay on that because I had to finish writing the book. And I wouldn't even bother making music. I didn't feel like it was worth it to make music when I couldn't enter the zone because my performance was never as good. Or I should say my beats weren't anywhere near as good. It was just a waste of time for me. Now, some people can do that. Some people are talented enough where they can make beats even when they're not in the zone. I'm not like that at all, right? So I need to be in the zone to get my best material, right? But whether you're talking about making beats, I used to do it a lot with conversation, right? I can just put myself in the zone with making good conversation. And you may find you may have experiences like that, right? So we're out with friends or you're at work and you find that you're just coming up with jokes and good conversation and your delivery's perfect and all your timing's good. Things are just coming into your mind and they're just hitting. Like that's basically when you're just in the zone, right? With making good conversation. When you learn how to control your subconscious, you can do that all the time and stay there if you want to, right? You can stay in the zone every day. You can live inside the zone, right? So you just live like, which I've done that before as well, right? There are problems with that as well, right? Which we're going to talk more about that later too. You don't want to really stay in the zone that much or for too long, right? I usually find that if I'm in the zone for like more than like 2 days roughly, like it starts to get too straining on my mind. Actually, we're going to talk a little bit about why that is in chapter 12. And then, we'll talk about why again in chapter 13. Well, it'll make more sense when we talk about chapter 9, right? And then we go over, there's like a secondary reason we go over chapter 12. And then in chapter 13, we talk about how to enter the zone. Like I said, which is a lot of theory involved. But suffice it to say, it could be a little straining to stay inside the zone after a while, right? But you could stay there roughly for about 2 days, right? And I did that, right? So you can just stay inside the zone, right? Well, no matter what the activity. If you want to be a good conversationalist, you can get in the zone with that. If you want to be a comedian and make funny jokes, you can learn how to just put yourself in the zone with that. It doesn't matter what the activity. It could be an activity you've never really even done before, right? Your performance level won't be as high if you've never done it, but you can still get into the zone, right? So that basically is the second thing you can do once you've learned to control your subconscious, right? You can increase your performance in anything, right? No matter what it is. You can, if you're a sports player, right? Or like I said before, boxer, right? I like boxing. You can learn how to enter the zone every single time you get into a boxing fight, and you can increase your performance more and more. I forgot to mention, you can actually learn how to go deeper and deeper and deeper into the zone, right? So there's layers to it. It's not like if you're either in the zone or you're not. No, you can learn how to get in the zone and then go deeper into the zone, right? And then you act more on instinct, which has to do with your subconscious. We'll talk more about that stuff later. But yeah, so you can increase, the deeper you go into the zone, the more your performance level increases. So it increases more and more and more and more the deeper you go. So that's another cool thing you can do once you've learned to control your subconscious. So I do that sometimes too, right? It's a more involved way of controlling your subconscious, but I do that too occasionally. I don't do it as much, but it depends on what activity I'm doing in my life, things like that. But yeah, when I do it, it's like amazing, right? Because I could just increase my performance in any way I want to. So it's pretty cool. So that's the second thing. Now, with these two videos, we covered pretty much what we're mainly going to be talking about in terms of what you can do with your subconscious. We've covered mainly what we're going to talk about in book 1. So in book 1, we talk about the secular topics. So secular topics is basically, when I say that term, and that's what I titled the first book, basically that just refers to ways of you controlling your subconscious that we kind of come across all the time or recognize or experience a lot in our everyday world, right? And we can easily recognize it's happening on the conscious levels, right? So we recognize we have emotions. We recognize that we have creativity. One thing I forgot to mention, I don't know if I alluded to it, but I didn't say it explicitly, is creativity as well. So creativity actually comes from your subconscious, right? And so when you increase your performance, you can make yourself more and more creative. So that basically ties into being in the zone with writing music or writing poetry or making beats, coming up with good jokes, things like that. You could just get yourself into the zone with all those things. So yeah, that has to do with these secular topics. Now, what we're going to talk about in the next 2 videos, right? Really 3, but the next 2 has to do with supernatural topics, right? So supernatural topics is what all of book 2 is about. And so in the next video, I'm going to begin talking about that. And so like I said, just to say it more clearly, right? So book 1 is going to be about emotions and performance, right? With things you experience every day. So we're not going to go into too many supernatural topics in book 1, but in book 2, book 2 is all of the supernatural stuff, right? So in the next video, I'm going to talk about the first important thing that we're going to discuss in book 2, and that has to do with God, right? So So yeah, that's it for now though. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.